Hello, I'm David Drewry, and it's a real pleasure to be presenting this lecture on Viking.TV. I've been lecturing on Viking ships and other cruise lines for over 10 years, sharing my passion for the natural world of our remarkable planet. I'm a polar scientist and have worked and travelled in the Arctic and Antarctic for many years. But when visiting these far-flung regions, you cannot fail to be drawn into the stories and the reports of the history of their exploration by Western countries. They're a sort of intoxicating blend of adventure, ingenuity, and endurance. So this talk is about one period of exploration. It involves some very brave men. Some might say foolhardy, certainly egotistical and self-motivated, who, over 100 years ago, challenged the geographical boundaries of the time with new technology, a lot of money, national pride, and bucket loads of courage. Their goal was to reach one of the great geographical challenges in one of the least explored regions of the planet, the North Pole and the Arctic. So my talk will cover how air exploration got started in the Arctic, the first balloon adventures, the exploits of Roald Amundsen, the famous Norwegian explorer, 2 expeditions by airship, and the foray by Captain Richard Evelyn Byrd. But let's begin in the latter years of the 19th century. It was an age of exploration and discovery across the globe, but some of the greatest challenges were at the poles. Already there had been much exploration of the Arctic lands and seas, which had been probed by ships, particularly in the search for the fabled Northwest Passage. A few land-based expeditions had made journeys into the Arctic regions of Canada, over Greenland, as well as Siberia. The great goal, however, lay further to the north, beyond the land, in the centre of the unknown Arctic Ocean, the North Pole. But this was a frozen sea, impenetrable to even the most sturdy and powerful of vessels at the time. The only prospect of reaching this ultimate goal was to sledge across the treacherous and unending pack ice, offering only deadly cold, shifting ice, and possible attack by polar bears. Now, I put this slide on because it sums up the dangers of the Arctic as seen in the middle of the 19th century. It's of the failed Franklin expedition of 1845 that tried to get across the Northwest Passage. It's by the famous British artist Edward Landseer and entitled Man Proposes, God Disposes. It hangs in a gallery or hall of the Royal Holloway College, part of London University. And that gallery or hall is used for examinations, and students feared sitting next to or close to this picture during their examination periods, and it would always be covered by a sheet. I have to say, I wouldn't fancy doing my exams in math or medicine with that hanging over me. Nevertheless, despite all of these problems of travel, some far-sighted individuals considered that it might be possible to take to the air and cross these inhospitable tracks in a lighter-than-air machine by balloon. Now, of course, in these times, 120, 130 years ago, balloons were still experimental and only moderate distances could be covered. Nevertheless, there were some who relished the challenge, and one of these was Salomon Andre, a Swedish businessman and engineer who was passionate about balloons and ballooning. Now, he'd bought a balloon from France and had flown it in an amateurish sort of way over quite large areas of Sweden. But now he set its sights on an attempt at flying over the North Pole. But how would you get there? The nearest accessible place to start his journey was Svalbard and its major island Spitsbergen, which at almost 80 degrees north meant that there was only maybe 1,100 kilometers, 600 nautical miles from the pole, which he considered was easily achievable. There were, of course, issues to do with winds, whether there were any mountains or islands that might block his passage, and where he might end up. But these were trivial considerations to Andre. In 1895, he goes to the National Academy of Sciences in Stockholm and gives a lecture. In these days, we would call it, he did a snow job on the community. He was pushing at an open door. Sweden at this time was looking for a more active role in the Arctic. So his lecture, going from Svalbard to the North Pole and Russia, taking 3 people, using special cameras to undertake scientific studies, being aloft for 30 days and making his hydrogen at the site, was music to all of these people's ears. The Academy granted him money, as did the King of Sweden and the big industrialist Alfred Nobel. But he was ill prepared. He had no Arctic experience, no safety measures, and the steering that he claimed was probably useless. But André's balloon started to be constructed in Paris by Henri Lechambre, of triple layers of Chinese silk, 3,360 one-foot squares stitched together, hand-stitched. 8.5 miles of seams brought them together and sealed away so the hydrogen wouldn't escape. He named this balloon Örnen in Swedish, or eagle, and he convinced a couple of colleagues to join him, Niels Strindberg and Niels Ekholm, and you see a photograph of Niels Ekholm here. So on to Svalbard and Spitsbergen. They travelled to Danskøya, a small island off the northwest tip of Spitsbergen, north of Magdalena Fjord. And some of you may have been to that part of Spitsbergen. Magdalena Fjord is a favourite place to view glaciers. Well, north of that is where they constructed an impressive balloon shelter and then waited for propitious weather. And they waited. And they waited. The 1896 expedition was a failure. The winds were consistently from the north. It was against them for the whole of this escapade. Furthermore, they discovered that the balloon leaked far more than they had expected. So they returned to Stockholm, and amazingly, they were fated as tremendous explorers with this venture to the North Pole. But they had never set one foot further north than the shores of Spitsbergen. But André was not to be thwarted. He was back again the next year in 1897 to make a further attempt. Ekholm had decided not to join them. He thought ballooning was not for him. And so now he had Knut Frankel joining Niels Strindberg. So here they are back at Danskøya. The balloon was in its shed waiting to launch. Here you see an inspection of the surface of the balloon, and they started waiting. And they started waiting again. But after a month, on the 11th of July, the southerly winds appeared, and André launches his balloon. It rises into the air. It starts drifting north down the fjord, beyond the mountains, into the Arctic pack ice, and was never seen again. 33 years later, in August of 1930, a Norwegian ship, an expedition led by Gunnar Horn, to a remote ice-covered island to the north and east of the Svalbard archipelago called Kvitøya, or White Island. When they get ashore, they find the remains of André and his companions. They find these remains along with maps, logbooks, and a camera, the photographs of which could still be developed. And this is the story the book and the camera revealed of the crash, the journey, and their deaths. On leaving Danskøya, the balloon rose to 700 meters, but the gas leak increased. And then they had 10 hours of flight, but then as the Balloon descended because of the lack of gas. They had these bumpy rides going down to the ice, rising up, down to the ice, eventually landing on the 14th of July. The map here shows in the red line the journey that looks like they took, ending up way north. And then they decided, having got fairly rudimentary survival equipment, they would make for Franz Josef Land because they knew there was a food catch at Cape Flora. But the ice and the currents were drifting them south. They changed their minds. Maybe we should head for Seven Islands, north of Svalbard, where there was another catch. But no, inexorably they were being pushed to the south. They encountered extremely rough ice. Their sledges were too heavy. They were making it difficult to be able to make progress. En route, they shot polar bear and seal for food. It took them almost 2 months, but eventually they arrived at Kvitoya, White Island, and on the 2nd of October, they started their shelter. We're not really sure how long they survived, probably weeks, maybe months, but it was a combination probably of food poisoning and exhaustion that led to their deaths. But their bodies were brought back by Gunnar Horn, and in Stockholm they were given almost a state funeral, most solemn and grandiose manifestation of national mourning, and they were hailed that they had died for ideas, science and progress. It was really quite a remarkable homecoming for people who had achieved, frankly, so little. Now, let us fast forward almost 40 years. The intervening passage had seen stupendous acts of exploration and discovery in the polar regions. Roald Amundsen, that you see here, had sailed through the infamous Northwest Passage. Peary had reached the North Pole in 1909, although Frederick Cook, of course, contended his attainment. In the Antipodes, Roald Amundsen again had been first to the South Pole in 1911, quickly followed by Captain Scott a month later. Shackleton's daring voyage in the Endurance and his rescue attempts marked the end of the heroic age. World War I had basically closed down such explorations for the time being. But in the post-war era, new players with fresh energy, new ideas, and a lot of new technology at hand started to enter the scene. So it was that in 1924, Roald Amundsen was visiting New York, where he met a young and very wealthy man keen on adventure, Lincoln Ellsworth. Now, flattered by Amundsen's attention, Ellsworth agreed to fund an expedition to be the first to fly to the North Pole. It should be remembered, of course, that World War I had spurred rapid advance of aeroplane development. The year later, 1925, the expedition acquired 2 Dornier Val, or whale, seaplanes. Seaplanes were thought to be appropriate because if they encountered open water or leads, they would be able to land on that as well as the ice. And they recruited 2 pilots, Hjalmar Riisa-Larsen and Leif Dietrichson. The idea was to explore the unknown area between Svalbard, get to the pole, and maybe then to Alaska. So they deployed, first of all, to Spitsbergen once more, this time to a place called Kings Bay and a small mining settlement called Ny-Ålesund, and we will come back to that in a moment. After many hours of launching their aircraft and battling winds from Kings Bay, they landed in a stretch of water something like 140 miles short of the pole. And here they spent 3 weeks waiting for the ice to shift and open up, giving them sufficient open water to be able to take off again and to return to Spitsbergen. It was a brave attempt. It showed the power of airplanes, but they hadn't got to the North Pole. Now, enter another player, a general in the Italian Air Force, Umberto Nobile. He was both an engineer and an airman whose vision, energy, and flair had made possible the development of some of the most successful airships of the time. Now, Amundsen's colleague, Risa Larsson, had met Nobile and had been deeply impressed by his technological developments and immediately saw the possibilities of using an airship to reach the North Pole. So at the first opportunity, he recommended Nobile to Amundsen. Well, the result was a triumvirate of Nobile, Amundsen and Ellsworth, and together they assembled a new expedition for a transpolar flight. The funding came from Ellsworth, $100,000, an enormous amount in those days, and that enabled the purchase of Nobile's N1 airship from the Italian government. Nobile would bring along his experienced crew and pilot the airship. And Amundsen, well, he was Amundsen, the leader. So in March 1925, the airship was handed over in the presence of Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator, always on the lookout for publicity. And the airship was now called Norge, Norway. Let's have a quick look at Norge. It was a large airship, 106 meters in length, 24 meters in height. It was made of an aluminium framework covered with rubber and contained a number of bags of hydrogen, almost 20,000 cubic meters, giving a lift of about 23 tons. And with its 3 engines, it could motor at about 75 miles an hour with an enormous radius of action. If we just look at Norge compared with one of our Viking ships, here you see it in relation at the same scale to Viking C. It's just about half, just under half the size of Viking C. And it was well appointed, but I have to say, I think the Viking C would have been a lot more comfortable. Now, the point of departure was again for Nobile to be Spitsbergen because of its accessibility, and at Kings Bay in Ny-Ålesund, where there were people and facilities. Now, such large airships were subject to the vagaries of winds and storms. So it was important to keep the vessel, they were called vessels, protected before it was deployed to the north. So this required another major construction activity, a vast hangar to protect the dirigible. It was built at Kings Bay during the winter of 1925 to 26. 600 cubic meters of wood, 50 tons of iron, and 10,000 square meters of canvas. An amazing activity just in support. Here are some pictures of Kings Bay and Ny-Ålesund today. The ones on the left I took a few years ago. The impressive mountain in the background has been named after these dirigibles and airships by the name that they all went by in those days, Zeppelins, after the German manufacturer. That is Zeppelin Fjället, very nice pyramidal peak. And on the right is the tethering post, still there, to which Norge and later airships were positioned prior to departure. And we'll see that in this next image, because in early May of 1926, the Norge arrives in Ny-Ålesund and Kings Bay, having flown right across Europe from Rome via the United Kingdom, Norway and Russia. Now, at Ny-Ålesund, there were the Norwegian coal mines, and Amundsen had arranged for many of the miners to assist in the handling of the airship, which required it to be pulled on long ropes in order to ease it into the hangar and to be tethered to its deployment mast. And you see the mast just to the very extreme right in this image. But there was a problem. Just as the team were about to launch, a rival arrives in Ny-Ålesund. Of course, they'd hoped to be the first to the pole by air, but US Navy Captain Richard Evelyn Byrd comes in with his aircraft, his pilot, Floyd Bennett, and 100 crew, and he comes into Ny-Ålesund and he says he is there to explore for new land in the Arctic Ocean and would also be flying by the pole. He'd spent several recent years flying in the Canadian Arctic and in Alaska, and here you see him in his polar garb. And later on, we know that he led a number of successful expeditions, very large expeditions, to Antarctica. So on the 9th of May, 2 days after the arrival of Norge, Byrd and Floyd Bennett fly to the pole and claim an historic first. It must have been a bitter blow to the Amundsen team. With the experience of hindsight, we now know from a scrutiny of the navigational logs that it was unlikely that Byrd reached really anywhere near the position of the pole itself. Undaunted, however, and 2 days later, the Norge is launched to the pole with its complement of airmen, explorers, and Nobile's terrier dog, Titina. The flight goes very well. 15.5 hours, Norge sets off and crosses the pole. Thereby, Amundsen and his colleague on board, Oscar Wisting, were the first to be at both poles, because of course Amundsen and Wisting had been on the expedition that reached the South Pole in 1911. Now, despite a little bit of icing, they reached across the Arctic Ocean and Wainwright in Alaska. Some winds blow them over into the Bering Sea, but they then land at Teller, north of Nome, and thereby become the first people to unambiguously fly over the North Pole and cross the Arctic Ocean. And here you see the group having arrived in Alaska, Nobile with his terrier dog, and they deflate the Norge and return it back to Norway. So it was a great success. The flight was a triumph. Nobile comes back to Italy and is greeted by huge crowds. And Mussolini sends him on a tour to promote the airship and Italy. And he's even sent to New York, as the left image shows. For Amundsen, he received very little praise, which admittedly was probably not inappropriate because it only really played a minor role. But it created bad blood between Nobile and Amundsen, and he cut off all contact with the general. Now it was Nobile who was fired up with great enthusiasm for further airship exploration of the Arctic. And this time it would be an Italian-only venture. Now, such expeditions were very costly, and Nobile had problems in raising the necessary funding. It was at a time, of course, at the end of the 1920s, where there was a world financial crisis looming. Nevertheless, assistance came from the city of Milan, which generously supported the expedition. But Nobile faced a different and much more worrying problem. His success had generated jealousy and bad feelings amongst the superior ranks in the Italian Air Force. They were part of the fascist machinery in Italy. In particular, the Undersecretary of the Air Force, Italo Balbo, an ardent fascist, became a particular enemy. And his resentment dated back many years when, as a more junior officer in the Flying Corps, he saw Nobile's development of lighter-than-air machines as a direct threat to his own fixed-wing flying ambitions. So once the Air Force, at this stage of the development of the expedition, could have vetoed the whole project, Balbo recognized that actually there was a very, very strong surge of public opinion for this venture. So he gave qualified support, but disingenuously saying, let him go, for he cannot possibly come back to bother us anymore. So the expedition got underway with Nobile's airship N4, now called Italia, flying north to arrive in Spitsbergen on the 6th of May 1928. Now, this is a rather fine 3D reconstruction by Michael Bata of the Italia, set over a Spitsbergen scene. Here you see the caboose beneath, the 3 motors to power it, and the wonderful Spitsbergen background. It was a deeply impressive machine. On the 15th of May, they made their first flight out of Kings Bay, first of all to Nicholas II Land in Russia. Almost 70 hours, 2,500 miles. It was a great success and proved the effectiveness of the Italia. Shown on this map on the right is also their journey all the way from Rome to Svalbard. Now it was time for the main challenge, the journey to the North Pole. All the preparations having been made, Nobile launched Italia at dawn on the 23rd of May. The Italia was, as one observer commented, a shimmering silver shape, glistening far above the ice as it gently motored out across the mountainous icy mountains of Svalbard towards the Arctic Ocean. The journey was uneventful, and they reached the pole after 20 hours on the 24th of May. But it seemed as though there was a rising storm, and the advice from their meteorological consultant on board, Finn Malmgren, was that they should now head back to Kings Bay. But in the cold clouds of the developing storm, the Italia began to ice up. And a few hours later, the vertical elevator, probably again because of icing, jammed. Nobile decides to rise up above the clouds to get into the warmer air with the sunshine, and also to obtain an accurate position by observations of the sun. But the sun expands the gas in the Italia, so some is vented to keep the airship stationary. They now go down below the clouds again to follow the ice surface. But in the cold air below, there is now insufficient lift, some of that gas having been vented and the air much colder. So they jettison some of their spare ballast and other gear, but they start to descend stem down. At 900 feet, they have an 8-degree tilt. This grows rapidly from 16 degrees to 19 degrees to 21 degrees. The Italia is being forced inexorably down towards the surface of the pack ice. And as he gets closer and closer, Nobile suddenly exclaims, "God save us!" The Italia crashes onto the ice, ripping off the caboose and tearing a great gash in the belly of the airship. The impact threw the crew in the caboose onto the ice and Nobile's dog, Titina. 6 were still on board the airship, which, relieved of the weighty caboose, now rose into the air and, caught by the winds, disappeared. And all on board were lost. This shows you where the airship went. It left Kings Bay in Spitsbergen, went north to northeast Greenland, and then following the meridian to the North Pole, and then with the storm they came south and crashed about 120 kilometers distant from the northeast island, Nordaustlandet, of the Svalbard archipelago, not too far away from Kvitøya. Memories of Andre? 9 of the 10 survived the impact, but several had injuries. The 6 remaining in the Italia, sadly shown here, were all lost. One man, Pomella, the foreman motor mechanic, died on the impact. The other 9 had various injuries. Nobili, a broken arm, leg, a broken rib and head injury. Cecchioni, 2 badly broken legs. Malmgren, shoulder injury and a damaged kidney. And Zappi, several broken ribs. They now started their rescue attempt. They brought out materials that had been stored in the caboose. They had already planned to have emergency kit on board, a portable radio, tent, food, and survival equipment. And they also had food that would give them reasonable sustenance. And they painted the tent red from some of the medical potions that they had on board. Here you see the tent, painted it red so it could be better seen against the white ice if there was an emergency search for them. Now Biaggi had soon got the radio operating, rigged an aerial, and was sending SOS messages. Now we have to come back to calling the ill feelings between the senior fascist military and nobile. On the support vessel, called after the city of Milan, Città di Milano, the captain had strict instructions not to become involved in any risky undertaking, and Captain Romagna was extremely cool to nobile. So whilst at anchor in King's Bay, and as the expedition became anxious over the whereabouts of Italia and nobile, the ship ignored the opportunity to listen in for any emergency signals. Indeed, they embarked on a period of transmitting personal messages from the crew back to Italy. Meanwhile, back on the ice floes, the 9 survivors had made their camp, but after a few days of not receiving any response to their radio signals, Malmgren suggests to nobody that he and Mariano and Zappi should attempt to reach land. Nobody's not keen on this proposal, but Malmgren insists, and they depart. Now, the loss of the Italia and its crew had become headline news around Europe and stimulated major operations which were dubbed the greatest rescue in polar area in history. Indeed, it was impressive. Public and private groups mobilized from all corners of the continent of Europe, Norway, Sweden, Denmark and Finland, France, Holland, Russia. Many tens of ships were involved, heading north. Many aircraft, hundreds of men deployed to search the area. And most surprisingly, Roald Amundsen forgot his animosity and in the true spirit of Arctic exploration said, "I'm ready to start a search." The only country that appeared reluctant to commit some rescue activity was Italy. Now, the captain of the Città di Milano, Giuseppe Romagna, because of all of these machinations with the fascists, was paralyzed with indecision, knowing that if he did this or that, news would get back to Rome. So he sat on his hands. One man, however, on the ship saw matters differently. This was Captain Gennaro Sora. He was in charge of the Alpine squad, detached to the Città with experience in operations in snowbound areas. And he was one of the best ski instructors in Italy. Sora reasoned that his well-trained men could make a search in the area to the northeast of Svalbard, where his careful reasoning had placed the position of the crashed Italia. His plan was placed before Captain Romagna, who refused to sanction it. After days of prevarication and negative responses, Sora took the matter into his own hands, and having been warned by Romagna, "If you go, I will have you court-martialed," departed with the comment, "Do as you like, but I'm going to look for nobile." Now, between the 5th and the 20th of June, numerous air sorties were flown out to search the areas where they thought the Italia might have come down, but all to no avail. On the 18th of June, Amundsen, who was there in an unofficial capacity and supported privately by a group of French aviators, got in his plane and departed from northern Norway, heading out across the Barents Sea for Spitsbergen. And regrettably, they were never seen again, lost over the Barents Sea. And so it was that we lost one of the greatest of all polar explorers, the White Eagle. But on the 20th of June, the survivors were spotted from the air. The red tent had done its job. A couple of days later, Swedish pilot Einar Lundberg set out to the area and lands at the red tent. And despite protests that he should be the last to leave, nobly with the severest injuries, is returned to Kings Bay. Lundberg makes another trip out to take out Cecchioni, the second most injured, but crashes on the rough ice. Fortunately, nobody is hurt. And here you see Lundberg with his crashed aeroplane. We now return to the party heading to find land nearby: Malmgren, Mariano and Zappi. They were headed for Foyne Island off the coast of Nordaustlandet, Northeast Island, which they had spotted, but a combination of bad weather, drifting pack ice and very rough and difficult conditions, as well as their injuries, held them back. And Malmgren, already weakened from the crash, died on the 16th of June of exhaustion. As part of the rescue attempt, the Soviet Union had sent their icebreaker Krasin, which had been in Bergen, to the area off Svalbard, where she arrived at the end of June, making slow progress through the pack ice. The expedition leader, Comrade Samiljevich, encouraged his crew with a reward: 100 rubles to the man who first sights the survivors. At 5:20 on the 11th of July, Krasin sights the party of Mariano and Zappi. He brings them on board, weak and exhausted, and Zappi had not eaten, apparently, for 13 days. 9 o'clock, Vigliari, with the main party of the survivors, spots Krasin and sends up smoke from the red tent to attract attention. It's seen on board, and Krasin maneuvers its way to their position, and all the survivors are rescued. Krasin brings the rescued party now back to Kings Bay, where they're taken on board the Chita. Nobile is placed under virtual arrest, accused by the fascists of responsibility for the disaster and abandoning his team on the ice. His enemies in Italy start a smear campaign. But he has captured popular imagination, and on his eventual return to Rome is greeted by 200,000 people. Nevertheless, the accusations continue. Viglieri was accused of cannibalism, and Captain Gennaro Sora, who, appalled at the decision of Captain Romagna on the Chita, and without explicit permission mounted that small rescue party over the ice, is court-martialed. It was later quashed because of insubstantial evidence. The pressure on Nobile was immense, and in March 1929, he resigns his commission from the Air Force and disappears into obscurity during the rest of the fascist era and World War II. It's 1945. The Axis powers are defeated. New men take over the Italian armed forces. the Air Force turns its attention back to Nobile, who is cleared of all charges and reinstated as Major General and later promoted to Lieutenant General, and, quite amazingly, given back pay to 1928. He moved to Naples. He taught and wrote at the university and died 20th of July 1978, an Italian hero and one of the great polar aviators. Many books have been written about his enduring memory and these air exploits in the Arctic, and several of those books are available on the Viking ships for you to read. So thank you for listening to this story. I hope it stimulates you to seek out a cruise to these amazing places, particularly to northern Norway and to Spitsbergen.